Ladies and gentlemen, we are live from the Isle of Man in the UK. This is John and Mike's MMA Corner.
I am joined right now with Campbell McClaren. Now, sir, there's many kind of accolades I could give you, but let's just say you're one of the founding fathers of the UFC. Let's put it that way. Let's just give you that one for now, because that's what we're here for today. To talk about, we're here to talk about your kind of involvement, your experiences, your time there. So, like, firstly, I've said it before, I'll say it again. Thank you for putting that time and effort in back then, because what we have now is all down to what yourself and several others combined effort. Really, it was because without one cog in the clock, I don't think the clock could have maybe turned out the way it did. I think it was a combined effort with everyone, really, and as much as everyone clashed heads, it did work out in the end. We finally got something back then, and you know, as much as the way the sport is now, I still look back to 1993. I still look at it now and I think it's amazing, and I do still wish it happened on Halloween. Sadly, it didn't.
Well, the date had moved around a little bit for the first event. The pay-per-view business requires a lot of lead time, and it was hard to put together a lot of lead time for a sport that didn't yet exist.
Yeah.
You got to think about that. There were so many aspects to this that we were sort of conjuring up.
Yeah.
It wasn't even planning so much as it was almost magic. Yeah, and that introduction is good. There's really the three people that really launched the UFC are, in addition to myself, Rorion Gracie and Art Davie. And I think without any of the three of us, it wouldn't have worked. Rorion had a fighting system, that was second to none, and he was willing to back up all the claims he made. Like a lot of people in the martial arts back then had exorbitant claims. Our system can beat anyone, fight three guys in an alley, all this sort of stuff. And then, when push came to shove and we actually started the UFC, we found a lot of those senseis where it didn't really show up. But Rorion and Royce did everything they said, right? They said they'd fight anyone, anywhere, anytime, under any, not under any rules, under no rules.
Yeah.
So without Rorion and, that family's lineage, we wouldn't be where we are. And then certainly Art Davie, figured out there was a business in selling the Gracie Jiu-Jitsu training tapes, and then started to see, was there something else? And I think, Art was very smart in putting together a package, and, he got together, a plan, did have the idea for the tournament. And then of course when they came to me, it was sort of my job to put it on television and, to bring together the pieces in a visual way, in a way that you could do in 3 hours, in a way that you could capture on video, all that kind of stuff. And, to me, that was a huge, that was the most fun I've ever had in my life. I mean, we had no idea what was happening on one. It's funny that the trajectory goes from unknown, no idea, right? I mean, that first fight, 13 seconds or whatever it is, right, with Taylor Tooley and Gerard Gordeau, and I remember watching it thinking, if all the fights are 13 seconds, this show's going to be over in 9 minutes. Even with the walk-ins. Even if we make the walk-ins really long, it's going to be over in 11 minutes. So, we really had no idea. But by 2, and certainly by 3, you start to see people become aware of Gracie Jiu-Jitsu and what it can do. And the martial arts start to mix.
Yeah, it did.
And you see, and you see the striking and grappling start to combine.
I feel like it was almost after the first one, everyone started to take classes in jiu-jitsu just so that they could counter what was going on. But what I thought was, like I say, that was an unknown investment from your part. Your job. If this was a music concert, you've done that before. You knew what you had, like the platform for it. You knew what the foundations were. So with this unknown investment, is what I want to call it. What was it then that made you want to do it? What was it about it that made you think, do you know what, we'll do it, we'll go for it? What was it about that stuck out, the idea?
Well, I got out my my diary from 1993, and I'm looking at April 93, so that's roughly, 23 years ago, coming up, right? And, I'm looking at what I'm working on, and I'd been on the set of Beverly Hills Cop 3 with Eddie Murphy. Eddie Murphy had a new record come out, My Girl Just Wants to Party All the Time, and it was a big hit, and he was thinking about launching a music tour, and my pitch to him was, when Cop 3 came out, to have a live pay-per-view, a concert with Eddie Murphy, launching the movie, and have his band, that was interesting. I was in London about that time too, working with a horror magician named Simon Drake. He had a show on Channel 4 called Mad Max, and we were working on a show we were going to do at Pinewood Studios, of course, the very famous James Bond studios outside of London, and we were going to do Iron Maiden's final concert with their singer Bruce Dickinson, and horror magician Simon Drake was going to kill all the band, chop off their heads, and mount them on spikes, and which we did do. It was a pretty interesting show. I'm also working on a pay-per-view with a comedian named Andrew Dice Clay that had been banned pretty much for pretty much everything, for racism, homophobia, and everything. Andrew was able to offend everyone. Yeah. Very well, not just a little. Really offend people. But he still had, a lot of fans. And pay-per-view was this sort of uncensored, unfiltered, kind of anything goes TV network, right? I mean, if the producer was willing to risk the production, the pay-per-view network would give it a try. If you had a good idea, they didn't put anything on, right? But so if you look back at that, the Eddie Murphy show didn't go, which is okay. Andrew Dice Clay, the band comedian, set Comedy Records. I mean, we made a lot of money on that one. And I saw controversy was very helpful as a advertising medium, right? Dice, the name of the show was No Apologies. And he did a very brilliant routine. If you remember the time Madonna had been urinating in Coke bottles and photographs, Michael Jackson was just starting to be found out, as a predilection for little boys. So Dice had this routine, and he said, fucking Madonna is sitting in a Coke bottle. Michael Jackson with his hand up a little boy's ass. But I'm the bad guy. And, it was just brilliant, and it was a free speech, a paean to free speech, and we did great business with it. It was wonderful. And Iron Maiden, so I learned controversy from Dice and for the pay-per-view business. And then with Iron Maiden, we also saw, that was a huge band 20 years ago. Yeah. And so we were able to pre-sell the video rights. If anyone listening remembers VHS, that used to be, a thing. And so we sold that around the world. So I sort of learned, how to pre-sell a pay-per-view property from Iron Maiden. So, Dice was July and Iron Maiden was August. We were supposed to do the first UFC in September. It ended up being November 93, but we were targeting September, but we just couldn't get it together. We didn't even, I don't even think the Octagon was built by September, and that's part of it too, is you start to build a sport, you need a playing field, right? I mean, there's a soccer pitch, there's a tennis court, there's a basketball. So where does one do no rules martial arts, right? I mean, what does that look like? And that alone, took quite a bit of thinking. We met with John Milius, the director of Conan the Barbarian, and he suggested the Octagon, because Conan had fought in a stone octagon. Okay, great suggestion, a stone octagon. He also wanted, fucking Greek columns. I mean, no, the answer is no, but thanks for the suggestion.
The start's fine.
But, as we start to think about it, where would you put something like this? Because we need to film it, right? So we thought plexiglass walls. Yeah. But as Horian pointed out, a guy could take another guy and smack his head into the plexiglass wall. It would have been very cinematic, but, not what we were after. after necessarily. We tried a type of pantyhose material, like a very fine mesh, but it seemed like you could suffocate someone by pushing their face into that. As you start to go down the checklist, it's like, what do you do? A boxing ring just wasn't going to work because, you need to contain the action. And with grapplers on the ground, they can roll out.
Yeah.
Horion didn't want the ring because he figured everybody would run from his brother Hoist. They would leap out. He wanted his brother to be able to get them. So, it starts to require a lot of creativity. I mean, you have to really think this stuff through. You're inventing something, right? Sort of on the spot, with the clock ticking, and live pay-per-view in months, And when we did the first TV commercial, what could I put in the first TV commercial? There's no footage. What am I going to show?
That's a good point, yeah.
Right? Yeah, that was a good point. We thought of that point somewhere in August for the September event. It's like, wait, what's in the commercial? And the truth of the matter was, we could have taped Horion or Hoist, but the thing is, they didn't look like scary guys. When Hoist, we did a photo shoot with Hoist, and he came out to New York. I mean, he looked like a model. He was 6'1", dark, good-looking Latin guy, 160 pounds, 40 regular. He didn't look like a monster. Yeah. And I was sort of selling monsters.
Yeah.
So, we took a bunch of old martial arts footage, of tournaments and stuff like that, and just kind of, back then MTV had a saying, if the footage looks, what do they say? If the footage looks good, make it look worse. If it looks bad, make it look worser. So that was sort of the visual style of MTV, if you remember, scratches and chopping cuts. So we did that to the footage, and that's what the first one is. Unrecognizable people doing weird karate moves.
And it was nothing.
And it was, there can be only one man, two man, one man needs. We had no idea. But I tell you, I did know that it was going to look like Mortal Kombat, at least in the open of the show. At least the opening was going to look like, 8 guys standing there wearing their traditional costumes, ski outfits, whatever. And some of the guys like Gerard Gordeau, we didn't tell him to wear those funky karate pants with his little jailhouse tattoos on his arms. I mean, that was it.
Yeah.
He lucked out with Taylor Tooley, just a fantastic first fight. And as they say, the rest is history.
Yeah, it was beautiful the way like you say, they were just so original and just so themselves, and that's what I think added to it, the authenticity of the fighters. And you weren't trying to, like they do nowadays with the UFC, with all the Reebok kit, everyone had to look the same. They all look different, and that's, I think, kind of what made it stand out. The entire, you look at Shamrock when he had his nice tight red shorts and his wrestling shoes, and then you had Gracie with the gi, and it just looked so different, but it just worked. I think it just worked. Then you got Jimison with the one boxing glove. It's one of them things that I think, I spoke to people before, and it's just going to stand out in time. Jimison standing with one glove, and no one will ever quite get their head around, why is that guy got one glove? And you went, well, yeah, he doesn't know what he's doing, that's why.
It was the truth. But no one knew what they were doing. Forrest Griffin said to me, remembering Ken's Speedos, and they were either bright yellow or bright red, and Forrest Griffin said he would have entered the original UFC had we let fighters wear man pants. It was time and place, and when you look at it, I mean, it certainly looks dated in a way, but on the other hand, it could be from the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's a very dystopian view of the future.
I know. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. So when you were doing this kind of meetings and organisation, and it's like you said, there's a lot of fun, and you just ping it. Basically, it was just a group of guys, just pinging ideas to each other. You're just having fun, more or less. You can rattle off anything and just see if it's stuck to the wall, so to speak. But can you reminisce any particular moments that happened? Any memories that just really stood out that kind of made everything happen?
Yeah, there's a couple. The creative process is a process. So there are aha moments, but it's also you put yourself in the incubator and you think about it, you talk to other creative people, and we were talking to fighters and martial arts guys and columnists, and laying a lot of the groundwork. And I think some of the aha moments, Horion sent a great video, again, back to VHS, and he narrated it, and I remember this very clearly, and I was in my office, and Horion is talking, he says, "We are in Rio, and the Gracie family goes on a picnic to the beach. We see a man on the beach who has insulted the Gracie family. We pick our smallest cousin to teach him a lesson." And you see, I don't know, there's like a 14-year-old Gracie stands up, the skinny Brazilian kid, right? And they're on the beach at Rio. And he goes over to this guy who's on a blanket with a girl and his friends. And the guy is a monster. He's like 6'3", cut, huge guy, like a weightlifter. And the kid goes over and kicks sand at him. And the guy stands up and peels off his, wife-beater T-shirt, right? And he's giant. And the little Gracie cut, and Horion's going, "Because he has insulted the Gracie family, we are going to teach him a very severe lesson." And so the little guy rushes him, knocks him down, gets on his back, chokes him unconscious, rolls him over, sitting on his chest, and punches the guy square in the face hard. The guy wakes up, he gets choked out again, he gets hit again. The whole time, Horion just going, "So we will choke out our opponents if they show us respect, but if you show dishonor to the Gracie family." And I'm watching this, and it's laugh out loud funny. It's much funnier than my impersonation. And it's dead serious too, right? I mean, and I look around, and Semfroy Entertainment Group, we had a big office up on Park Avenue and 57th Street, great part of New York. We're a media company, and slowly people are heard. I'm playing the tape loud in my office, and people start coming in. And I look, and the company had a big radio division, had a big music division. It was mostly a music company. There's 20 or so people standing in the doorway watching this tape, like rapt attention. They can't believe what they're watching. And I looked up and I go, "Yeah, this will draw a crowd.
Yeah.
This is it. And then, the head of the company came and started screaming at everybody to get back to work. And I was like, "You're missing the whole point, man. This is the work." We found something that people will stand in a doorway and watch on VHS with a crappy voiceover. You know what I mean? And so when I saw that tape, I knew we really had something there, and I knew the Gracies were very for real. And then, I'm looking in my daybook on May 27, 1993. I fly out to LA, and I go out to meet Horion, and Horion introduces me on that trip to John Milius, who directed Conan the Barbarian, who wrote parts of Dirty Harry, who wrote parts of Apocalypse Now. "I love the smell of napalm in the morning," is John Milius. That's his quote. "Do you feel lucky, punk?" That's John Milius. Like, he's the toughest tough guy writer in Hollywood, right? So I'm meeting with Milius, and, I've got a meeting with Arnold. And I went to see Horion in his dojo. And we were walking around, and it's in Torrance. And Torrance is nicer now than it was 20 years ago. It wasn't a horrible neighborhood, but it was kind of a working class, tough neighborhood, right? You could get in a fight on the street in Torrance. It's not Mayfair, right? It's kind of a tough neighborhood. So anyway, I'm walking, and then I look over on the sidewalk, and there's a guy pacing us. I'm walking with Horion, and he turns to the guy and he goes, "Not today, if you ever want to find out if someone will fight, you say to them, your mother's a whore. If that doesn't make them fight, they don't want to fight you. And, you know, I'm with some gunslinger. You know, it's like the Wild West. You know, we're walking down the street and people are challenging, you know, Top Gun. You know, and he turns to them, he goes, your mother's a whore. You know, and I go, this guy is the ultimate badass. First off, the guy could have had a gun, by the way.
Yeah.
And all jiu-jitsu in the world. You know? But Hoyt didn't even blink. He didn't even stop walking. You know, yeah, whatever. If a guy wants to fight, say your mother's a whore, and then if he doesn't fight, he doesn't want to fight. Like, okay, that's good advice. Thank you. Thank you, Sensei.
I'll keep that.
Keep that in mind. So then we go to Arnold Schwarzenegger had opened a restaurant and called Schatzi on Main. You know, he's Austrian, and it was a chance to do like high-end Austrian food or something. You know, I just got back from Vienna. Austrian food is nice and everything, but it's not like people are clamoring to get more Austrian food. Anyway, the restaurant didn't work, but it was Arnold. And we went to the opening, and Arnold came up to me, and he said, you know, I told him what I was thinking about doing. He knew Horion. And Arnold said, yeah, you need to do this. This would be a huge hit. This is like a gigantic hit. How can you not do this? Why are you even here talking to me? You should go work on this right now. I said, okay, great. No, I mean, because it was the Terminator. I mean, you know, he was at the peak of his career, and he's a very smart guy, right?
Yeah.
And a competitor. You know, he was the real deal, right? He wasn't just some bogus movie star. And I said to him, would you come and be part of this? He goes, oh no, Arnold is now becoming a family movie star. I can't come to this. But it's still going to be a big hit. You must do it. You must do it. So I was like, okay, all right, we're getting somewhere. So the Terminator thinks this is a big hit. It's drawn a crowd in my office. I'm with arguably the baddest guy on the planet. I mean, literally, Horion will seem like he'll fight anyone, you know. So, you know, you start to put this together, right? And we had a publicist. There's a guy, you know, a lot of people want credit for the early days, you know, and I have to say, you know, John David Isaacs, who's a very dear friend of mine and who I worked with at Semaphore, he was there from the beginning. He was encouraging it. He's the one that helped build it into a business. David Isaacs helped codify the rules. He's the one that helped write unified rules. So, you know, because he was not as big a mouth as me, you know, and didn't do the interviews. Not many people know his name, but David had an integral part in it. Don Gold, who just recently left the UFC. Since, you know, 93, I met Don Gold after the first UFC, and he wanted to buy the video rights then. Don Gold built it into, you know, a giant international, you know, video business, video games. He did all that. So a lot of people worked on this, but I'll tell you, there's one guy who doesn't want credit for it, and I'm always sort of calling him out, and his name is Dan Cloris, and he was a very famous publicist in the U.S., and Dan represented Paul Simon, Howard Stern. Do you know Howard Stern?
Howard Stern show,
Saturday Night Live. He represented Lorne Michaels, John Belushi. You know, he'd had a list of huge stars. And Dan Cloris heard about this, and he goes, I can get anyone in the world to write about this. Are you kidding me? A no-rules fighting match inside a cage, live on television? Who do you want to talk to? And we did a press release after the first one that Dan helped me write, where we said the fight would be stopped. The referee could stop the fight, doctor's intervention, throw in the towel, or death. And John, you know, I mean, everybody asked me, would you still put death in the press release knowing, you know, what was going to happen, right? Because that was sort of that set the groundwork for all the trouble. But, you know, I still have to say, to this day, I can't think of any fight that would continue with a dead opponent, right? I mean, we said we would stop the fight if someone died. I've yet to see guys die in boxing matches. That does tend to stop the fight.
Yeah, they don't.
So it was one of those things, in those early days where I was saying banned in 49 states, but we were in 7 or 8 states. There's 50 states in the U.S., right? So the arithmetic just never worked. One man, 2 men enter, 1 man leaves. Everybody left the octagon. It was everyone wanted to buy into it, and I was writing, crazy stuff to say. But the truth of the matter is, when you saw the UFC, it looked pretty crazy.
Yeah. Oh no, it did.
Right?
I
was saying as wild a thing as I could say.
Yeah.
And then you saw it, and it was pretty wild.
Oh no, I'm with you on that. Absolutely. I was blown away by it when I started watching. I just couldn't get my head around how open of a fight it was. I'm so used to boxing. For so many years, people are used to boxing where 2 guys just stand up, they punch each other, and that's it.
Yeah.
That's what everyone was used to, and it's one of them things where, for me, I couldn't get my head around how much there was that people could do to each other in a fight, and it was allowed. The referee wasn't stopping it. Only thing they were stopping was if you poke him in the eyes and the general kind of stuff like that. But bar that, everything went, and I was like, this
stuff like that. And after a while, we did stop the groin shots.
Thankfully, yeah.
So, what was it? Joe Sando is in UFC 5. Where Keith Hackney pounds on his...
Oh, yeah, with the elbows. Punches him, yeah. That's just... That sticks in my mind. Yeah.
This is flash ahead to 1996 when we do UFC, what I called the Ultimate, which was the Tournament of All Champions, right? So we did a TV commercial then. I mean, after I had the first one, after we had the first UFC, the TV commercials were quite easy, by the way, because there was dozens of things that you wanted to show. Before, there was, I don't know what to show. After the first one, I was very clear on what to show, right? There was a lot of violence, a lot of incredible action, and very super visual, right?
Yeah.
Just every fight was very visual. But when we did the TV commercials for the Ultimate, I'm a bit of a classical music fan, and the nice thing about classical music, if you're a TV producer, is you don't have to pay royalties. It's royalty-free music. And if anyone remembers the film Clockwork Orange, there are times when extreme violence can really be pushed forward with a classical soundtrack. Yeah. Right? You put Beethoven under, that sort of thing, and it's even more dramatic. So I took a Christmas song, Tchaikovsky's, the trade pack from the Nutcracker Suite, and that's what I used when Joe San was getting his nuts cracked, what happened, apparently some classical music fan saw that, and she went crazy. Where was she from? It wasn't New York. She might have been from Boston, which is, in a lot of ways, very conservative. And she said I had ruined classical music, that I had ruined Christmas music, and she had a little campaign going. And I ended up getting called a lot of things, but, I guess I got to put on the list, I ruined classical music, and I ruined Christmas music.
Why can't she see the irony? That's she needs to get a sense of humour. That's what she needs to get. That was the thing about as the UFC events went on, you like you say that the people you brought in that are still around now. How did you end up meeting?
Royce Gracie and Ken Shamrock, by the way,
they're still
who
around.
just had a fight, which was the highest-rated Bellator event of all time.
Crazy, absolutely crazy. And Ken just sadly he did fail a drugs test, but the thing is he wants the match void and a rematch.
Ken?
Yeah.
Oh, come on.
I don't know how. I don't know. Maybe he just failed all.
His nipples have muscles.
He failed being awesome is what he failed. That's what it must have been. I don't know. It's crazy, these things. But so did Kimbo Slice as well. He failed the test as well. Drug test. No idea why. And it's just something in the water. But yeah, the people that came into the sport as the events went on, how did you end up meeting some of these people that are still around now? How did you end up, like, for example, like you say, Joe Silver and, Joe, how did you cross paths and how did they become part of this crazy roller coaster. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, great question. You know, I don't know if it was a roller coaster, John. It was more like a rocket. You know, it just went up and up and up and up and up. You know, for the first 3 years, I mean, I've said this before, you know, when you look at the buy rates, there were roughly 20 million pay-per-view homes then. There are, in the U.S., there's 100 million now.
Yeah.
Right? So that's a five-fold difference, right? So we were doing buy rates of 250,000, 350,000 buys. If you multiply that by 5 to get a pound by pound comparison, right? So you're looking at buy rates that are kind of comparable to what Connor and, you know, Misha Tate just did. I mean, fantastic buy rates. We were, at one point in Japan, Japan did not have, for those that don't remember VHS or don't know what it is, it was a tape that you could rent or buy. And in the U.S., you could rent or buy. In Japan, you could only buy. And for a while, the number 1, number 2, and number 3 tape in Japan was the UFC. It was UFC 1, UFC 2, and UFC 3 were 1, 2, and 3. So we were on, there's a TV show called Friends that, you know, still a very famous show. Yeah. We were on the finale of one closing season of theirs, huge ratings, cover of Mad Magazine, a satirical magazine in the U.S. And, you know, I mean, it was nothing but success for the first 3 years. Yeah. It just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And people think that, you know, the UFC struggled, and the John McCain who later ran for president, who came after me and came after the UFC, I mean, you know, that started to come in more like 96, 97, 98, you know, the first 3 years, it wasn't a roller coaster. It was a roller coaster, but just climbing up to the top. And, you know, it just was amazing stuff. You know, it's funny, I've got the day book out here, June 23rd. I had a meeting with Donald Trump.
Oh, right.
Some of your fans may know.
That's an interesting character. At the moment, he's very interesting, yes.
You know, Donald Trump was an early supporter of the UFC. I mean, he wanted it for the casinos. I did a pay-per-view show with him, a music show with a guy named David Hasselhoff.
I know Mr. Hoff, yes. I think a few people do, yeah.
Casinos. I was talking to Donald about doing an American Gladiator pay-per-view live. Yeah. And remember the TV show? So we were going to pump it up. But after I started the UFC, I just thought American Gladiator's bogus. Yeah. I mean, who wants to see guys hit each other with those big, you know, ear swab sticks? Yeah. I mean, it was silly. The comedian Andrew Dice Clay that I referenced earlier, he had a line where he said, after you've seen X, you can't go back to R. And, you know, I think that's very, very true. You know, once you've seen the UFC, you're not going to be interested in American Gladiators. Yeah. Or for that matter, John, if you remember, kickboxing was starting to take hold. I don't know if you...
Yeah, it was doing well then, yeah.
But it was starting to get popular in the U.S., and the UFC just blew it out. And there was another promotion called Tough Man, which essentially was amateur boxers.
Right.
And it was gaining popularity. And the UFC just blew it out. You know, anything with that sports feel, fighting, combat sports, the UFC just quickly swallowed up. So...
I'm not surprised.
No, was there a question I was answering? I totally lost track.
It's fine. I was just asking about how the likes of Joe Rogan and Joe Silver came along into it.
So, well, Joe is a very good friend of mine. My background prior to the UFC and prior to the pay-per-view business, I was very much in the comedy business in the U.S. As some people know, I'd managed the comedian Larry David from Curb Your Enthusiasm, Joy Behar, who's a star here in the U.S., and other comedians. And, you know, I'd done a couple sitcoms, and, you know, and I knew pretty much every comedian. And Joe was an interesting guy because he was a legitimate tough guy. And a lot of comedians are like skinny arm, you know, a New York word, nebbishy, you know, kind of nerdy guys that get their revenge with words.
Yeah.
But, Rogan looked like the kind of guy that if you heckled him, first he would come back with an insult, then he'd come out on the stage and beat the shit out of you in the club. So, and he was a Boston guy and a tough guy, and he'd actually had, he says professional kickboxing fights. I would take him at his word. He certainly had amateur kickboxing matches. So he was, he knew what it was like to be a fighter. And I brought Joe in on UFC 11 because we were having the crazy issues, again, going back to how do you create a sport. Remember, when we were doing the tournament, if you got hurt and dropped out, and we put someone in to replace you, that fighter replacing you might not have had a previous fight. So he sort of had an advantage over a guy that had won one fight. And at one point, and this is going to sound like a joke, but this is actual serious, we considered taking the replacements and having someone hold them and someone else beat them up to sort of, give them some injuries before we threw them in. Totally ridiculous. But, that's the kind, what do you do? Right? A guy's got to buy. That's a serious advantage in a 3-fight night. Right? So there were issues, and famously, Steve Janum got a shot to come in on a situation like that. I had to run to Janum thought he was out for the night and was in his car getting ready to drive home when I caught him in the parking lot and brought him back in. He ended up winning the tournament. So there were a lot of moments in the UFC where the producers were going, what do we do? Because we didn't have precedent. Stuff was happening for the first time almost every night. So we needed someone that could stall on air and think and talk and be entertaining. And, comedians and podcasters, John, when their guests let them get a word in, are good at that kind of thing. And Joe Rogan was very good at talking. He liked fighting. He looked good, right? He's a funny guy, smart guy, was very interested in the sport. Brought him into UFC 11, and which was a total mess. Things were not going well, and I remember he showed up with him. But he came on, and he quickly got it. He knew that the event was a mess. He tried to put some order to it, and I think mostly the thing I like and respect about Joe Rogan is 20 years later, he's probably more excited about the UFC. His ardor and passion has not diminished. In fact, has probably increased. And I like Joe. I think he's great on the air. He was a comedian I knew, and his manager, who's still his manager, manages a comedian named Kevin James. Jeff Sussman and I are very dear friends, and Jeff was very instrumental in putting that deal together. So that came from my comedy background. Joe Silva was sending me, I think I've said this on your podcast before, he was sending me yellow legal pads filled with notes on what a moron I was. And this is before the internet, so he's FedExing this to me, and Campbell, that was completely stupid. What were you thinking? This is what you need to do. You need to develop blah, blah, blah. And it was pretty interesting. So I'd offered to rig a contest. We were having a super fan contest.
Right.
And I offered to rig it and let him win. I hope there's a statute of limitations on contest rigging. But Joe famously doesn't like to fly, but so he didn't fly out to claim the prize. And so we ended up hiring him as a consultant or whatever, and and he just went on, and he offended me, and then when I left, David Isaacson, the guy that was running SEG, took over, and Joe had to tone it down in terms of the insults. I'm a pretty easygoing guy, so Joe had to adapt to the next group, and then of course, I'm not sure Dana would have taken to the insults either. So, Joe has adapted his style, but in a lot of ways, Joe's Stephen Hawking. He's the master brain behind almost every matchup in the UFC.
Yeah.
And I think he's literally 3 and 4, matchups down the line when he does matchups. I think he does three-dimensional matchups. And he sees a lot of things. He's a very smart guy, and he's a very decent, straightforward guy, too. I think fight business is tough business. Boxing is maybe a sleazy business. Joe Silva is the opposite of all that. I think he's a really good, straightforward guy. John McCarthy was training with the Gracies, so, Horeon really brought him in. Our first set of referees, reputedly, I cannot verify this, were in Brazilian secret police.
Oh, right.
And helped disappear some people in Brazil. And needed to be not in Brazil for a little while. That's the rumor from...
What I love about them,
I didn't know those guys. I never saw them again.
They were great for the first one. Guys are tapping, they're not doing anything about it. They're brilliant. They couldn't speak that much English. They were great. They
had the sense that if someone had come into the octagon with a giant, cloth bag and put their opponent in a bag and taped it shut and put them in the trunk of a car, they wouldn't have said anything. They would just continue to monitor the situation. It was pretty scary. John, I read, I'm kind of a history buff of sorts, and, I've read that the famous gunman and sheriff Wyatt Earp, who many cowboy movies about, lots of legends. He was actually brought in the late 1800s to clean up boxing when prize fighting was considered, certainly immoral and illegal in many states in the U.S. In fact, in Detroit, they used an 1860 law against prize fighting against the UFC when we did the UFC in Detroit. So I always thought Big John was like Wyatt Earp. He was, brave, loyal, true, uncorruptible. He was big.
Yeah.
He knew the sport. He took it very seriously. His father, Joe McCarthy, had helped develop the idea of the modern SWAT team. He was the weapons instructor for LAPD. LAPD, by the way, very badass guys. Yep. So here you have this purple belt in Gracie Jiu-Jitsu, the former power lifter, weapons instructor, LAPD. It's like, come on. I wish I'd thought of that. Horeon thought of it. It was spectacular. And we were able to use John for, it's funny. He was brought in a lot of ways to sort of clean things up. But because of who he was, he sort of made the sport seem better.
Yeah.
Because if that's the type of official you need, someone that can kick pretty much everybody's ass.
Yeah.
That's who you have as official. Because when you look at football, when you see the refs don't scare me.
No.
In any sport, right? They are nerdy guys that try to run and keep up with the action. You look at Big John. Big John looked like he could beat everybody in the octagon.
Yeah, it's huge, man.
So this idea that he knew what he was doing and he was very capable is right. But on the other hand, when we showed shots of Big John, you knew this was not a tennis match.
Yeah.
So, I think Big John, John and I we have an interesting relationship. Big John had to cash a lot of the checks my mouth wrote. So I was out there going, no rules, we'll rip your head off, we're kicking into the stands, we'll take your bodies and we'll bury them in the parking lot. I'm saying the craziest shit I can think of. And John is in there going, no, there actually are rules. And this is a legitimate sport. And I'm paying a lot of attention. So, and I tell you, John and I had some conflict on Tank Abbott. And to me, Tank Abbott, Dave Abbott, to me was the perfect thing. He was exactly what we needed in the UFC. And to Big John, he was exactly what we didn't want in the UFC. And it was also a cop criminal sort of thing happening there, right? Tank Abbott.
Yeah.
His view of the jailhouse was different than John's. John's was looking in, Dave was looking out. So when he came in and Dave was very abusive to Elaine McCarthy, who was John's wife and who ran operations, logistics, and everything. This is the most wonderful person, sensible, reasonable, professional, polite, no nonsense, but, a really nice person. And for Dave to just be abusive to her, he was just looking to get to John.
Yeah.
And that was a nasty and ugly thing. And, so we sort of set up a little bit of a conflict there. But Tank, here's a quick Tank story. So, listen to the list I'm putting together. Joe Rogan, Joe Silva, John McCarthy, and I think soon after, and I'm not going to take credit for Horion or Hoist because they found me, but Tank Abbott's on that list of people too, right? Because what happens with Tank is he opens up the sport to the non-martial arts fans, right? And we had seen that, there was a lot of martial arts fans that had nowhere to go. They had nothing to watch. If you were a karate guy or taekwondo guy or whatever you were, there was no way for you to watch this, And Olympic taekwondo, that doesn't really do it, So we drawn a big martial arts audience, and what Tank did, and he said his martial art was bar can do, with the vodka training method. He opened it up just to the yahoos, right? And a bunch of guys, and I sometimes say, around the world, only Americans say America. Everybody says the States or the U.S. or USA. Americans call themselves Americans, and a lot of Americans don't use the A. They're Americans. We're American. And Americans love Tank Abbott. And, he just was... He looked like a fat guy that could take a punch and hit back. But the truth was, Dave was a power lifter. I saw him bench 600 pounds. He rolled around with the Brigham Young University wrestling team, which was world-class, Mark Schultz and Olympic athletes up there. He played football in high school. I mean, he was a legit athlete, a drunk one, but, he was. And he played down his training because it was a better story that he just walked in from the bar and beat the shit out of you. Yeah. And so I think, Tank, was a big part of that story, and we used him every chance we got. And, when Tank said, I'm getting sexually excited when I hurt people, and stuff like that, that's going to work. Yeah. So, Tank, I think, is on that list of people that really helped launch those early days.
I think he's one of the ones that, like you said, he reached the people outside of the martial arts circle, and he's kind of like the early days of the early Ronda. Like, Ronda touched base with people outside of the sport, and that's what Tank did.
I compared him to Ronda in an interview. Actually, where I was at... I forget which UFC it was. And John came over, Big John came over, and goes, don't ever compare Ronda to Tank. Tank's an alcoholic. She's an Olympic athlete. And I go, come on. I mean, you can't argue with John. First, he's big. Second, he's a cop. He's Big John. It's like, you're not going to win. But so when I go, come with me, and we went over and we saw Ronda. And I said, Rhonda, you saw what I wrote? She goes, yes. I go, what did you think? She goes, it was hilarious. So, at least I got off the hook on that one, right? Rhonda thought it was funny she was compared to Tank Abbott. One of the articles had a picture of Tank and Rhonda next to each other, and it was hilarious, But you know what? I think that's a great way to look at the UFC and where the UFC is. Rhonda is an Olympic athlete. Rhonda is a superstar. Rhonda's a great talker. She really is the new face of the sport. Holly Holm, notwithstanding, she's on the cover of Sports Illustrated. Yeah. She's going to be a movie star. She took this sport to the next level. She really, really did. And, Connor was there adding, hot air to the balloon. But, it really is Ronda that I think has taken the UFC into its next generation of world-class athlete, world-class sport. So, I got to say, the old days are great. Original UFC, nothing like it. Probably will never be anything like it ever again.
Nope.
But if Tank's my guy and Ronda's the new guy, you have to, full credit to Lorenzo Fertitta. He had a vision to make this a world-class sport. I knew this was going to be a hit. Always knew it was going to be a hit. but I didn't know it was going to be a world-class sport.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I can't say that's what I had in mind when I put together the first one. But Lorenzo did. So, his vision is what's going to keep the UFC going.
Yes.
My vision launched the UFC.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's the persistence of these parties, all parties from the start to now. That's got it to here. Without the people literally putting everything they can into it, that it wouldn't have happened. Because so many obstacles came up, yet no one didn't. Yet you all got over the obstacles. You didn't stop and let it break you. You all got over the obstacles, and that's what That's why. We need to remember everyone who's been involved in this sport, because it was something that wasn't that easy to get going. After, like you say, after the first 3 years, it started to really get tough, and it was just sticking it out, getting through those tough times.
Yeah, absolutely, and tough times is a bit of an understatement.
Yeah.
Remember, I always figured someone would come after the UFC, but I thought it would be a famous TV evangelist, or some do-gooder. I figured I could take a do-gooder.
Yeah.
But John McCain, he was a POW in Vietnam. He's a war hero. Ran the Armed Forces Committee in the Senate. A respected senator. That was a tough opponent. That's not who we wanted to fight. And then he brought in another senator from Colorado who'd been a judokan in the Olympics. I think had a bronze medal, Ben Nighthorse Campbell. And the fact that his last name was Campbell didn't help me at all. He didn't see that as any sort of relationship he wanted to foster with an ancestral background. So it was tough. And then what happened was there were a lot of regulations coming up in the U.S. Congress about the cable TV business. And the cable TV business, for anyone that knew, was making about 40% of their profit from adult programming.
Ah, right, okay.
And it was something, they didn't want to. This is before the internet, John.
Yeah.
Right, when you actually had to pay for stuff like that. And they used the UFC as sort of a scapegoat. So instead of saying we're going to turn off the adult programming, which there was no way in the world they were going to do, they decided they wanted to sort of offer up the UFC as something that they would turn off. And the boxing industry was coming after us too. I mentioned the Ultimate before in '96. If I would flip through my day books, I would always have marked in red letters where Mike Tyson was going to fight on pay-per-view. And we always avoided a Mike Tyson pay-per-view because they were monsters. They sucked up all the press, all the TV ads, everything. It wasn't just that everyone watched it. It was the media circus around it, shouted out everything else. So when we decided to do the Ultimate, which was going to be our biggest show ever, 8-man tournament of all men that had won a tournament, right? So it was all badasses, right? And we wait for Mike Tyson to set his date, and he does. And then we set our date, and then we get everything locked, print the materials, get ready to go. You do pay-per-view 90 days in advance, and once those 90 days, you're sort of in gear, right?
Yeah.
You made the commercials, you paid for advertising, you're locked, kind of, contractually, you spent money, you're going down that path. So, 3 weeks before the date, they announced Mike Tyson's moving to free TV on Fox Broadcasting. And he hadn't been on free TV ever, I think, and certainly there had been no major boxing match on broadcast TV for free in about 15 years. It was all closed circuit, right? It was either pay-per-view or closed circuit. Meant you go to a movie theater and you would pay $20 and you watched on the big screen there live. So kind of a weird coincidence that they move it to free on the night of our biggest pay-per-view ever. And I've never had a satisfactory answer for why that happened. I had a chance once to talked to Don King. It wasn't really a talk. It was more like, hey, did you move that thing on purpose to compete with the UFC? Because what the UFC, what? You know, it wasn't even acknowledging the UFC existed. So, I don't know what happened there, but that was pretty interesting. So, I had McCain and Don King after the UFC. And going back 20 years, Don King was a pretty formidable guy. He's
huge.
Pretty much out of it now. But back then, Don King was boxing.
Yeah.
So you have Don and war hero, top senator, future presidential candidate John McCain. That's a tough fight.
That's a tough fight. The thing is, John McCain went back on what he said. He's kind of, I won't say he supports UFC now, but he did go back on what he said back there, and he kind of promoted it in a way. He kind of, he recently said that he not say supported, but he recognises it as a sport now.
Yeah, I mean, the Fertittas are very smart guys, right? They've worked things from a political side. They have added rules. They really have done their job. And that's part of what you get if you turn something into a world-class sport.
Yeah, absolutely.
I would have gone at McCain very differently, but, I was literally being forced out of the company at that point because I'd said some crazy stuff, and it seemed like it might be better to let everything cool down. But, you know what, honestly, you've got to look at this and say to yourself, in the scheme of things, in the world we live in now, even the world we lived in back then, is the UFC really the threat to Western civilization that it was portrayed as?
Yeah.
I mean, seriously. You gotta go.
It staggers me the way they portrayed it then. What I want to do now is, last thing I want to ask is, when the UFC came back, when it first started, did you ever think that you would still be involved in mixed martial arts today?
That's an honest. If I try to answer honestly, really, that's a very tough question. Because I will say, around 99, 2000, until the Ultimate Fighter, I was very bitter, and I was very angry at anyone that was doing anything with the UFC. I felt like my children had been kidnapped. I felt a real sense of. I've never, John, some people say, Campbell McClaren owned the UFC or didn't own the UFC. I never owned the UFC. I worked for Bertelsmann, for BMG. The pay-per-view division was called SEG. I was an employee. I had a stock plan, but I didn't have any ownership in the UFC. So I never owned the UFC. And I do believe with my whole heart, I don't believe I would have sold the UFC. I love the UFC. I think I would have parked it and, let everything cool down and see if I could get back into it after a little while. It took tremendous resources to keep the UFC going. Sure. Funding the shows when they were losing money. Also, all the legal bills, the political challenges, the lobbyists, the lawyers. But I don't think I would have sold the UFC. But I was very bitter at that time period. I felt like I'd been forced out of the company. I thought the direction that the folks were running was a lame one. I think creatively it was lame. I think politically it was lame. They were just kind of saying, okay, go ahead and fuck us. Yeah. Go ahead. We'll take it. We'll squeal a little, but that's all we're going to do. And I would have been a little more aggressive. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. Did I thought I'd get back? If you'd asked me this in 2002, I would have said absolutely not. But after the Ultimate Fighter, I thought, what, this is interesting and it's compelling because the guys are so real, so authentic, and so compelling. That as a TV producer, I started to think about it again, and that's where I did the Iron Ring, which was sort of the hip hop version of the UFC. And I will point out the TV ratings beat Ultimate Fighter. When we were on a much smaller network of BET, which is Black Entertainment Television, and yet we were regularly beating the Ultimate Fighter in the ratings. But, and had a bunch of rap stars, and Floyd Mayweather was on it, and that was a buck wild show. And that got me thinking about it again, and that really is what led to Combate Americas. I think in Combate Americas, the important point is this sport is still so new.
Yeah.
You and I, we know it, and we think it's established. But the sport's not even 23 years old. No. And so that means if you look at football, this is 1900.
Yeah.
Right? Or whatever the arithmetic is, 1908. Whatever and pick any sport, and 20 years into the sport, what does that sport look like? Nothing like it does, once it develops. So, I just came back from a trip. I was in France, and I was in Austria, and I was in Vienna and Paris. And as I talked to people and reached out to people, there was no real understanding of MMA or even the UFC in those two countries. And those are reasonably big countries, right? Certainly France is a huge market, right? So I think, did I think I would get back into it? I guess probably not. But now that I've come back in with Combate Americas, I've actually had the idea that this sport is nowhere near developed. I think this literally could be one of the top sports in the world, top TV viewership, top fan base, and it's really become a young person's sport too. It's really a millennial sport, and I think one of the reasons for that is there's no bullshit. It's not corrupt like boxing is.
Yeah.
You saw with the Misha Tate, Holly Holm fight, McGregor Diaz fight. MMA and the UFC in particular do fights that boxing would avoid at all costs.
Yes.
You don't get to get a 49-0 record by taking any fight.
No.
You've got to carefully pick those fights.
Yes.
So I think the great thing about MMA and the great thing about the UFC, because they're somewhat synonymous in my mind anyway, is the sport is just growing. It's just beginning. It's just starting. There's going to be millions and millions and millions of more excited fans coming online, and new athletes.
Yeah. Definitely.
And look, I've also seen. I think grappling is diminished in importance in the UFC for the first time in its history. Right? I think you've seen high kicks. You're seeing low kicks. Muay Thai is really. You can really see Muay Thai skills and techniques in the UFC. You're seeing what happens when there's real punchers. Conor, I think, is a real puncher. I think Holly Holm was a real puncher. So we're starting to see a little more boxing influence. You're seeing Muay Thai. Grappling's always going to be important. But at one point, it was sort of the be-all and end-all.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that's true anymore.
You look at Coleman and Dan Severn back then, Shamrock as well. Just grapple, get you down and just beat you.
Even you mentioned Forrest Griffin. The guy hits hard, but I wouldn't call him a world-class striker. I think his base really was grappling.
Yeah.
And I think, and Ronda's base is judo.
Yeah, it is. Yeah. Stephen Thompson. With his karate kind of taekwondo point style scoring, absolutely just went through Johnny Hendricks like a hot knife through butter. Just absolutely destroyed him. It was incredible to watch. And Hendricks was a former champ. Just recently. It was crazy.
Hendricks maybe benefited from a certain time period where he was able to gain that. I'm not.
Yeah, certain periods. Some guys
I've got my favorites, and I've got guys I think sort of lucked into their prominence, and then that's true in any sport, right?
Look, like you said,
look at Joe Frazier. Joe Frazier's biggest problem in life was a guy named Muhammad Ali lived at the same time as he did.
Bad timing. Look, like you said, you got Combate Americas. I'd love to get you back on again to talk about it when it's all launching and going and starting, because there's big, great things happening with it. So I'd love to get you back on in future, Campbell, again to kind of help with that kind of promotion of it, so to speak. But before we finish here, how do people join you, Campbell, online on social media to maybe even ask you questions about the old days of how it started?
A great way to do it is Twitter. I'm very active on Twitter, and it's at Campbell Combate. And combate is spelled, if you don't put up a graphic, it's Combate. It's combat with an E on the end, so it's Campbell Combate. Or search Campbell McLaren on Twitter. And we regularly have some spirited exchanges on the old days. Big John is on there keeping me honest. Of course, Lorenzo follows me, Ken, Hoyce. You know, it's sort of a gathering of the original UFCers. And stuff comes up pretty regularly. And oftentimes people ask me questions and you know, I've said before, look, I don't have a great memory, but I've got a great imagination. So I can always come up with a good answer. It's not necessarily the right answer, but and then Big John says, Campbell, you remember that wrong. That's absolute bullshit. So it's been pretty funny. You know, so anyone that's listening, come on, follow me on Twitter. You know, I tend to answer anyone's questions that come on too, so it's kind of fun.
Honestly, Campbell, it's always fantastic listening to you and just hearing new stories and new bits. And I'm grateful for every time you come on. So thank you very much again.
It's always good to talk to you. It's good to see you, whether we're in Scotland or you know wherever we are. So listen, I think I might be in the UK coming up soon. So I'll shoot you. I'll let you know. And
yeah, definitely.
Maybe we'll get there again.
That would be fantastic, Campbell.